The office hummed like a living thing, air conditioning sighing, printers coughing, the low, constant murmur of people who had learned to keep their private storms small. Clara kept her door open because she liked the light that spilled across the corridor, and because she liked the idea that work could be a place where things were ordinary and therefore safe. He appeared on a Tuesday, leaning against the glass of the conference room as if he had always belonged to the architecture of the place. He wore a navy coat that looked expensive in a way that didn't shout, and he had a way of tilting his head when he listened that made Clara feel, absurdly, like a secret being kept just for her. "Do you work here?" she asked, because the question was the only polite thing to do. He smiled, and the smile was the kind that rearranged the room. "Not exactly," he said. "I'm meeting someone." She learned his name in the small, ordinary exchanges that make people feel known. "Daniel," he said, and when he said it, the syllables settled into the air like a familiar song. He had a laugh that came out of his chest and a habit of tucking a loose curl behind his ear. He asked about her weekend, about the plant on her desk, about the photograph of a beach she kept in a drawer. He remembered the details of things she had said in passing and returned them to her like gifts. Clara found herself timing her coffee breaks to cross his path. She lingered by the copier, pretending to be busy, and felt a ridiculous, warm certainty that the world had tilted toward him. When she asked him one afternoon if he would like to get a drink after work, her voice sounded like a stranger's in her ears, brave, thin, and hopeful. He didn't answer. He smiled, and he said, "I'd like that," and then he walked away to a meeting and did not return her message. She waited for a reply that never came. The silence that followed felt like a small physical thing, a paperweight on her chest. Days passed. He would appear in the doorway of the conference room, in the hallway, at the vending machine, always near enough to be noticed and never close enough to be claimed. Sometimes he would look at her and the look would be so full of recognition that Clara's heart would leap. Other times he would be absent for hours, and she would find herself scanning the office like someone searching for a face in a crowd. On a Thursday, she followed him, only a few steps, only to the elevator, and when the doors closed, she realized she had no idea which floor he had gone to. She laughed at herself in the elevator mirror and felt foolish for the ache that had settled into her ribs. She told herself she was being ridiculous. She told herself she had been lonely, and that loneliness made her invent company. But the office is a small ecosystem of facts. People know where people sit. People know who is on the payroll. People know who has a badge and who doesn't. When Clara asked casually at the reception desk whether Daniel worked in their building, the receptionist's smile thinned. "Daniel?" the receptionist said. "We don't have a Daniel on the directory. Do you mean Daniel Price? He used to come in sometimes, but he wasn't on the staff list." Clara's mouth went dry. "He comes in a lot," she said. "Maybe he's a contractor," the receptionist offered, "or a visitor. We get a lot of visitors." Clara left the desk with a polite nod and a hollow feeling. She walked back to her desk and opened the company directory, fingers trembling. There was no Daniel. There was no record of him in the calendar invites she could access. There were no emails from him. The office hummed on, indifferent. That night she sat at her kitchen table with a mug of tea gone cold and a photograph of a man she had loved folded in her hands. The photograph was old, edges softened by years of being taken out and put away. "Tom," she whispered to the empty apartment, and the name felt like a stone she had been carrying for a long time. Tom had died 2 years earlier in a rain-slicked accident on a stretch of road that had once been ordinary and now felt like a scar on the map of her life. The funeral had been a blur of faces and flowers and the kind of words people use when they are trying to stitch a wound closed. After the funeral, the apartment had been too quiet. The bed had been too big. The mornings had been a series of small betrayals. Coffee made for one, a toothbrush left unused, a sweater that still smelled faintly of him. Grief, Clara had learned, is not a single thing. It is a weather system. It arrives in storms and in long gray drizzles. It rearranges the furniture of your mind. Sometimes it brings with it hallucinations that are tender and cruel in equal measure. She had told herself she was done with the hallucinations. She had told herself she would not let memory become a substitute for life. And yet here was Daniel, who looked like Tom and moved like Tom and said things that Tom would have said if Tom had been younger, if Tom had learned to wear his hair differently, if Tom had been a man who could step into an office and not be a ghost. Clara began to keep a small notebook. She wrote down the times she saw Daniel, the words he said, the way his hand brushed hers when he handed her a file. The notebook filled with tiny, ordinary details that felt like proof. Proof, she told herself, that she was not losing her mind. Proof, she told herself, that grief had not swallowed her whole. One evening, as rain tapped the window like a nervous hand, Clara opened the notebook and read back the entries. The handwriting looked like a map of a life she had been trying to navigate. She read the line where she had written, "He didn't answer my invitation." She read the line where she had written, "He remembers the photograph in my drawer." She read the line where she had written, "He smells like rain and lemon soap." A sound at her cubicle made her look up. Mike, from the desk next to hers, was standing there with a paper cup of coffee and a hesitant smile. Mike had been in the office for months. He was the kind of man who kept his stapler in the same place and who hummed tunelessly when he typed. He had a nervous way of tucking his hair behind his ear that made him look younger than he was. "Hey," Mike said, "you okay? You look distracted." Clara blinked. The notebook was still open on her lap. She closed it and tucked it under her arm like a secret. "Just tired," she said. "Long week." Mike shifted from foot to foot. "Do you want to get a drink after work? There's a place down the street. Thought maybe you'd like to go, if you want." The offer was small and ordinary, and it landed in Clara like a hand on her shoulder. She looked at Mike properly for the first time, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the freckle near his left eyebrow, the way his voice caught on the word maybe. "Yes," she said, "I like that." She expected, absurdly, to feel a pang of guilt, as if she were betraying someone by saying yes. Instead, she felt a lightness she hadn't felt in a long time, like a window opening after a season of closed curtains. That evening, as she gathered her bag, she felt a presence at the edge of the room. Daniel stood by the conference room glass, hands in his pockets, watching her with an expression that was almost, but not quite, a smile. For a moment she thought she would turn and tell him she had changed her mind, that she would stay and talk until the office emptied and the lights dimmed. But she didn't. She walked past him, and as she did, she felt something shift. The air around her seemed to thin, like fog lifting from a field. Daniel's outline softened. The navy of his coat bled into the gray of the hallway. He looked at her with a tenderness that made her throat ache, and then he was gone. Outside, Mike waited under the awning, rain beating on his shoulders. He looked nervous, but he was present in a way that mattered. He held the door for her and offered her his arm with a clumsy politeness that made her laugh. They walked to the pub 2 blocks away, the city lights smeared by rain. Mike talked about small things, his sister's new job, a terrible film he had loved, the way his cat liked to sleep on his laptop. Clara listened and found herself answering, not with rehearsed lines but with the truth of what she had been carrying. She told him about the photograph in her drawer, about the way grief had rearranged her mornings. Mike listened with the kind of attention that is rare and therefore precious. At one point, he reached across the table and brushed a strand of hair from her face. His hand was warm and real. Clara felt the memory of another hand, colder now, recede like a tide. She did not feel as if she were abandoning Tom. She felt as if she were making room. When the night ended, Mike walked her to the bus stop and asked, shyly, if he could see her again. Clara said yes. She said it with a steadiness that surprised her. On the walk back to her apartment, the city felt different, less like a place that had been hollowed out and more like a place that could hold new things. She thought of Daniel once, as if he were a photograph she had taken down from the wall and set on the table. She thought of Tom and the way his laugh used to fill the kitchen. She thought of Mike and the way his nervousness made him honest. Grief, she realized, had not been a single visitor. It had been a house guest who had overstayed, rearranging the furniture and leaving traces of itself in every room. Sometimes the house guest takes the shape of someone you loved. Sometimes it takes the shape of a stranger who looks like someone you loved. But the house is still yours. That night, as she turned the key in her door, she felt a presence at the edge of the hallway. Familiar, gentle, and finally at peace. For a moment she saw the outline of a man who had been both memory and mirage. He smiled, and it was the same smile she had loved, but softer now, as if he were letting go. "Be happy," he said, and the words were not a command but a benediction. Clara nodded, though he could not see her. She stepped into the apartment and closed the door. The photograph of Tom sat on the table, and she picked it up and held it to her chest. She did not feel the weight of a ghost. She felt the warmth of a life that had been and the possibility of a life that might be. Outside, in the dark, Mike walked home with his hands in his pockets and a small, hopeful smile. Inside, Clara made tea and sat by the window watching the rain. The world was not fixed, it never would be, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe without apology. Somewhere between the rooms of memory and the rooms of the present, something had shifted. The man who had been a figment of grief faded like mist at dawn. The man who was real, awkward, kind, and alive, offered his hand, and she took it.